sit with friends, which makes it interesting since we don't see them a lot during session. And I'm so happy to be sitting next to our Vice Chair, Senator Locke. But to stream this and make it easier for the public to see us and help staff, we need to assign seats next time. So if you guys want to sit together down there, let us know, and we will we'll accommodate any seating arrangement to the best of our ability. So, thanks everybody for coming. Got a good crowd here. I'm wearing my Don Scott suit. Y'all know about that? I'll tell you later. Anyway, I went out and bought this so I could look like him. Because it's an inside joke. Okay, Mr. Greer, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, and members of the Commission. I'm Hal Greer, the Staff Director of JLARC. Mr. Chair, we have a very full agenda for you this morning. First, you're going to hear from the Auditor of Public Accounts, who will present the APA work plan. Next, JLARC staff will present the findings from the review of VCU Health's capital process and governance. Then JLARC staff will present the findings from our review of several transportation issues. And then finally, we'll present the findings from our review of Virginia's custom grant program. One note about the work that we're presenting today: it is typical to prepare a report and a slide presentation for studies that we conduct. However, for a combination of reasons, we felt that it was most prudent to provide only a slide presentation and not a report for both the VCU Health and the transportation studies. The slide presentations for these two reviews do provide more information than a typical slide presentation that accompanies a report. Mr. Chairman, I would like to mention one item before we begin today's agenda, the JLARC study of legislative compensation. After further conversation with the chair and evaluating our staff capacity, we've determined that we can accelerate the study of legislative compensation, and we'll plan to complete it this year instead of in 2025.
Everybody got that? If you work hard enough, you might get a pay raise here. we got to depend on, we got to get the staff to work hard for us here. Please continue.
Mr. Chairman, before Stacey Henshaw begins her presentation on the APA work plan, I thought it might be useful to discuss very briefly the relationship between APA and JLARC. Over the years, the General Assembly has been very intentional in creating ties between the APA and JLARC in the code. The auditor sits on JLARC as an ex officio non-voting member. The code requires JLARC to appoint a temporary successor if the auditor position becomes vacant, and to assume the duties of APA if the auditor fails to perform their duties. And the auditor is directed in the code to report significant financial irregularities or defaults that it finds to JLARC. Based on this relationship, it has been long-standing practice for the APA to present their annual work plan to JLARC for approval. So with that, I would like to introduce Stacey Henshaw, who will present the APA work plan. Stacey?
Good morning, Ms. Henshaw.
Good morning.
How have you been?
Pretty good. How about yourself?
We're working it.
So good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. As Hal said, I'm Stacey Henshaw. I'm the Auditor of Public Accounts, and I have with me today Eric Sandridge, my Deputy Auditor for Technology and Innovation, and he'll be assisting me with the presentation. Today, we plan to present to you our work plan for our upcoming year, as well as our updated salary scales, both of which require approval by the Commission annually. Typically, we'd also provide you a summary of our results of our priority work plan, but because of time constraints, I know Hal said this is a packed agenda, we'll be presenting that information at the July JLARC meeting. So we are trying to keep everything on track today, and so it's tough being the first on the agenda, and so we are going to be going through this work plan pretty quickly. The one thing I'll point out is in your packet of materials that you received, there is a work plan report that has a lot more detail than what we're going over today, more detail about the agencies we're covering and the amount of hours we're spending at those agencies, and so hopefully that will help supplement our presentation. I know there are a few new members on the Commission, and so I know Hal briefly talked about the relationship of JLARC and APA, and I wanted to briefly go over the type of work that we perform. And so unlike JLARC, the work that we perform remains pretty static from year to year, and so who we audit in terms of the agencies and institutions doesn't change a lot. But what we audit can vary from year to year, particularly with regard to federal programs. We audit executive branch and judicial branch entities, and we mostly perform financial statement and financial related audits. So we're looking at internal controls over financial processes. We're looking at IT with regard to their financial operations and IT security. And we're also looking at compliance with significant laws and regulations related to financial operations. Currently, we have a staff of 112, and most of those are auditors. And we're about to grow to 125. I know that might seem like a big jump, about 10%, but that's very typical for us to bring in a big group in June. We have some attrition during the year, and then we'll have a new hire group in June that comes in that's primarily recent college graduates. The work that we're proposing today is work that we'll perform primarily during fiscal year 2025. And most of that work is mandatory, with the major focus being the audit of the Commonwealth's financial statements, or the Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, or ACFR as we call it, and the single audit of federal funds. And that work, that the single audit's required to be performed as a condition of the Commonwealth receiving federal funding. And then we also have other mandatory projects, primarily the audit of the Commonwealth's higher education institution financial statements, as well as independent agency financial statements. And for whatever time we have left in our work plan, we use a risk-based approach to determine what audits to perform. But right now, we don't have a whole lot of capacity to do additional work besides our mandatory work. To start with a couple of highlights here, one of the major drivers of our work plan are the audits of the higher education higher education institution financial statements. And so these hours have been going up over the last few years, and the reasons for that are new accounting standards that are more complex, so it takes them longer to prepare their financial statements, and we've been finding some issues with the implementation of some of those new standards, as well as they've had a lot of turnover in their accounting and financial reporting, as well as IT staff, and we've been finding more issues with internal controls and compliance in those areas. And so the good news is those hours have leveled off. So we don't really have a lot of, they're pretty much consistent with the prior year, and there are not as many new standards on the horizon. So we're hoping to kind of keep at that level now. The other good news is the hours that we have in our work plan for the single audit of federal funds have started to transition back to the pre-pandemic level. And so the last few years, we had a lot of additional federal programs that we had to audit because they had new funding streams, there were new programs that were pandemic related, and now that those funds, those programs have basically started to get back to where we were prior to the pandemic. And we still have a few pandemic related funds that we're auditing, but not anywhere near where we were. And that was a real stress on our work plan because we didn't have additional staff to do that work, but it was mandatory work that we had to do. In our work plan this year, for the first time, we have the Cannabis Control Authority, and so that's a fairly new entity for the Commonwealth, and so we'll be performing a financial-related audit of the authority. So once again, that involves looking at internal controls over their financial operations, as well as compliance with significant laws and regulations over their financial operations. And so we're getting ready to get started with that, and we'll issue a report later this summer. And then one thing you'll notice in a couple of slides is we have decreased hours for our cycled agencies and special projects. And so this is really the main discretionary work that we have in our work plan. And we're trying to rebalance the timing of our audits. And so I have a slide in here that I'm trying to illustrate that on. And so as you can see, that top bar is the work that we do to support the audit of the state's financial statements and single audit. That includes three of our higher education institutions that we have to audit for that coverage, as well as our independent agencies. You can see it's over half of our work plan. And then we have the work that we do with the remaining higher education institutions, and then that pot of hours there, the other audits and special projects, which is discretionary. And then finally, our local government and judicial audits. And so we have a separate set of staff that do our local government and judicial audits, and that work is spread pretty evenly over the year. And what we're trying to control is that we've started to have a lot of overlap between our mandatory deadline projects. And so we have a hard deadline for the state's financial statements of December 15th and the single audit has a deadline of at least finishing that within 60 days of our financial statements. And so we used to have a buffer there so that we had a little bit of cushion when doing our work and meeting those deadlines. And so because we've been doing more work with the same amount of steps, we've eaten into that buffer. And we're trying to get back to where we don't have as much overlap and have more buffer there again in case things come up so that we can continue to meet our deadlines. So now to the numbers. We are proposing approximately 145,000 hours this year, and this is, like I said, slightly less than what we've had in the prior year. And I'm going to talk a little bit, Eric and I both are going to talk a little bit about what that consists of on the next few slides. Briefly here, I want to talk about our audit support projects. We have about 8,000 hours that we're proposing for those, and this is work that's not tied to a specific agency, but it supports our audit process. So our risk analysis that we do, legislative and budgetary monitoring, the development of audit tools, and our quality control program that helps to ensure we meet the auditing standards we're required to follow. It also includes our internship program. And so we have, the internship program is the reason for the decrease this year. We've decided to dial back our fall internship program a little bit because we found that that's our busiest time of the year, and it's a little hard to manage an internship program when we have a whole lot of things from an audit perspective and are up against the deadline. And so we have 6 interns that have joined us for this summer, and we're going to give some of them the opportunity to continue with us into the fall, but we're not bringing any new interns into the program. So this next slide just shows a high-level overview by function. I'm going to cover executive departments on the next slide, and Eric's going to talk to you about cycled agencies and special projects, so I'll briefly cover the other 2 areas. Independent agencies includes the work we do over the Commonwealth's retirement system, lottery, ABC, Virginia College Savings Plan, and it also has those hours in there for that the Cannabis Control Authority audit. And so there is a slight increase there this year related to that authority. Local government and judicial is the work that we do to prepare the local government comparative cost report. And while we don't audit local governments, we have oversight over their audit process. So that's also the guidelines we provide to them. It provides time for us to answer questions they may have, as well as perform a quality control program over the work that they perform over Virginia's local governments. And so I'm going to talk more about that process next month when I go over results. And then the remaining time there, we audit the entire judicial system of the Commonwealth, and so that is for us to go into the various courts across the Commonwealth and review their financial operations. And there's a little bit of time in there where we audit state funds that are collected by localities. The last slide that I'm going to cover today is our hours by secretariat in the executive branch. As you can tell, we're spending 110 hours in the executive branch, so that's over 75% of our work plan. And I've already talked about the major driver, and you can really see it's illustrated on this slide, about 60,000 hours that we spend auditing the Commonwealth's higher education institutions. And so that's over half of the hours that we spend in the executive branch. And the other 2 drivers there are the finance area and health and human resources area. And so obviously that's work we're doing over to get support for the Commonwealth's financial statements as well as for the single audit of federal funds. And pretty much these hours have remained consistent from the prior year. And, the main area of decrease, as I've already mentioned, is with the federal work that we're doing because of those pandemic funds dropping off. And at this point in time, if you have no questions, I'm going to turn it over to Eric Sandridge.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
You mentioned the Cannabis Authority. How about the Opioid Authority? Are you working
Eric
on
is going to, if you can hold a minute, he's going to talk to you about that. But that is coming up in our work plan, and he'll explain the cycle that we're going to do. So great question. Good lead in.
Thank you. We have a couple agencies, maybe more than a couple, that are almost majority funded by federal dollars, non-general funds, including the Virginia Employment Commission and the Health Department. They've both experienced issues in the last few years. Can you talk about how your agency may have helped them through this, or?
So when we've been in, if you've looked at our reports in those areas, and in particular, health and human resources is our top area where we've been identifying opportunities for improvement. And that includes the Department of Health, medical DMAS, as well as social services and behavioral health. And so we have been identifying internal control and compliance related, so financial issues as well as IT security issues that we've been pointing out in their reports. We also had, we annually audit the Employment Commission, and once again have been working to identify areas where they can improve their internal controls and operations. And we will, when we cover our results next month, we'll hit on some of those findings in the areas where we've had a lot of findings in that presentation.
Thank you. Welcome. Can you introduce yourself again?
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission. My name is Eric Sandridge. I am Stacy's Deputy Auditor for IT and Innovation at the APA. So as Stacy mentioned earlier, the bulk of our work is mandatory audit work where we have an annual audit requirement. Our cycled agency bucket, as we refer to them, really represents the rest of the agencies, that discretionary bucket of agencies where there is no mandatory annual audit requirement. Generally, these agencies and institutions don't support our audit of the state's financial statements, the ACFR, or the single audit of federal funds. So we have a different approach for how we audit those agencies. We divide them into two pools, a pool 1 and a pool 2. Pool 1 are our low-risk agencies. We send them an internal control questionnaire that they complete. We review the results of that questionnaire once every 3 years, make recommendations regarding their internal control structure, and issue a report with our findings and recommendations. Then our Pool 2 agencies are those agencies that we consider to be higher risk. We've completed a risk assessment process, looked at the programs that those agencies are providing, the funding that they're receiving, whether there have been any changes, any areas of concern, and then they make it pulled into this high-risk Pool 2 cycle. For those agencies, we go in and we perform a more detailed audit of a specific program or a specific cycle. So this is where the Opioid Abatement Authority will come in for the next spring. Since they've started distributing funds in fiscal year 2024, we do plan to begin looking at them in this upcoming work plan. We have decreased our hours in this area. As Stacy mentioned, we are trying to right-size a little bit, but also for most of our Pool 2 high-risk agencies, we've been auditing them repeatedly over the last few years, and they need some time to address some of our recommendations and get caught up. And so we're actually kind of using this as a little bit of an opportunity to stay out of their way so they can fix some things and also right-size and get back on track with regard to the timing of our work plan.
Eric, would you mind telling us again one more time what would be some examples of a Pool 1 agency?
Sure, and if you look in our work plan report here on page 6 and 7, we have the entire list of agencies, but it's some of our smaller entities like State Inspector General, Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, a lot of smaller entities that we wouldn't do a full-blown financial statement on it. And
that would be Pool 2.
Those are Pool 1s.
Oh, those, okay.
Our Pool 2s are usually bigger agencies that aren't quite rising to the level of significance that they would get pulled in as part of the state financial statement audit. There are agencies that move in and out of that bucket.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No problem.
It's on page 6 and 7.
Yes.
For everyone to answer my own question. Thanks.
Just briefly mentioning special projects, and we do have some more detail in that work plan report on our special projects on pages 8 and 9. But to cover a few that we spend time in, we manage the state's transparency website, Commonwealth Data Point. We have reduced some hours in this area because things have remained relatively stable for us. We're not actively changing anything on the website. We are looking at perhaps employing some new technology to make that website better. We're in the early stages of that process and figuring out which direction we want to go, how much it might cost, whether or not we need to hire or employ consultants to assist us in that transition. So we are looking at doing some different things there, but there is a decrease in hours in the work plan related to that because we've kind of stabilized. In terms of local government fiscal distress analysis, we run a fiscal distress model on all localities each year. We're going to talk about this in detail next month, and so we're not going to go into a lot of detail today, but that is part of our special project budget. We do plan on issuing an update to the comparative report for higher education this year. We do this periodically. It's one of our risk-based special projects. This is essentially ratio analysis of all of our higher education institutions. We basically put the institutions in one of three buckets of comparative categories, so our highest research, then our medium-sized research institutions, and then our master's and baccalaureate institutions. And we run ratios that are commonly accepted in the higher education community and look at trends over time to see how we're performing. And then the last item I'll mention here is fraud monitoring. While we don't regularly investigate fraud ourselves, it is a code requirement to report fraud to us. We follow and monitor the investigations of the State Inspector General as well as state police and try to determine how that any events or any frauds might have an impact on our audit work or on the agencies we audit and figure out how that affects our work plan. As Stacy mentioned, each year we present any updates to salary scales. One thing I'll mention here is that what we've done is we've increased the minimum and maximum salary scales by position level by 3% in accordance with Chapter 2 of the 2024 Acts of Assembly. You'll see those on the next slide, and we will ask you for your approval of those in a couple of slides. I want to also touch on our general compensation plan. Each year we do award bonuses to our staff where warranted for exceptional performance, also for passing professional exams like the CPA exam, and also to promote retention in our office, as well as awarding raises where warranted for merit or promotional opportunities when warranted in accordance with our budgetary restrictions. As I mentioned, these are our salary scales by position level, and that should be in your packet as well as in that work plan report that Stacy mentioned previously. Briefly, I also wanted to touch on our peer review results. That report is part of that work plan packet that we provided to you all. We recently went through our peer review process. It's once every 3 years. A team from other state auditors' offices around the country comes to our office and reviews a sample of our reports to ensure that we're complying with all relevant professional standards that are promulgated by the AICPA and GAO. And so they reviewed the period March 1st, 2023 through February 29th, 2024. We always joke about this a little bit. We did receive the highest rating of pass, which doesn't sound extremely impressive, but pass is the highest that you can get. We didn't have any deficiencies included in that report, and generally speaking, everyone was very complimentary of our office, the processes that we have in place, and the work that we do. So we did just want to thank our staff for the hard work that they've put in over the last year in making that possible. So at this time, I'd be happy to take any questions, if you all have any questions.
Do the members have a question for either of the presenters? We need a couple of motions here. One to approve the work plan for the year.
So moved. Second.
It's been moved and seconded that we approve the auditor's work plan for the year. Is this a recorded vote? Or we just say, is it? Okay. So all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Say your work plan is approved. And now we need a motion to approve the salary scales that the agency can use.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded that we approve the salary scales at this point, and all in favor, say, any discussion of the motion? Okay, all in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Okay, the salary scales have been approved. Good work. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, members.
See you next time.
See you next month.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, next up is the presentation of our review of VCU Health, in particular its capital project process and governance. Before we begin the presentation, I want to make a few brief points. First and foremost, I'd like to recognize the leadership at both VCU Health and VCU for their willingness to work with us on this review. The leadership and staff at both entities have been extremely professional and responsive, and I want to publicly thank them for the time and the attention they devoted to assisting us with this review. Mr. Chairman, you have a response to our review from the VCU president in your packet, and I wanted to call your attention to one point that the president made, which is that we did not provide an exposure copy of the report to either VCU Health Board or the university's Board of Visitors. It has always been our policy to not provide exposure copies of our work to board members for various reasons, but foremost because as soon as we do, the report, which is still very much in the draft stage, is considered a public document. Moreover, the primary purpose of the exposure process is to check the accuracy of our findings, and in general, the experience and knowledge of agency staff tend to be the most useful for this purpose. And finally, Mr. Chairman, the unraveling of VCU Health's lease on a facility that was to be built on the site of the City of Richmond's former public safety building near Clay Street prompted calls for this review. Our presentation addresses the Clay Street project and what happened, but the information we're presenting on the project has generally already been reported on by the media, and we won't dwell on what happened with Clay Street this morning. The report instead focuses on findings and recommendations to improve VCU Health's capital process and governance structure going forward. The recommendations are in some cases informed by the Clay Street project, but you'll see that the team relied on many additional sources of information. With that, I'd like to introduce Lauren Excel, who led this review. Tracy Smith, who oversaw the review, will also join Lauren up front and may also provide input in response to questions that you may have. Lauren?
Welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. As Hal said, I'm Lauren Excel, the project leader for our review of the VCU Health System capital process and governance structure. I want to thank my team and staff at both the health system and VCU for their time and assistance with our review. As you may remember from a few weeks ago, our review was a fairly targeted review focusing on the health system's capital process and governance structure. We conducted numerous research activities for the review, including interviewing health system and VCU senior leaders, surveying health system board members, and reviewing various documents. To briefly summarize the key takeaways from our review, we found that the health system has improved its capital process following the Clay Street project, but it needs to develop a long-term plan, strengthen a few of its policies, and increase staffing. The leadership structure should be changed to reduce the potential for VCU influence on health system operations and decisions, and to free up the CEO to focus primarily on the health system. The health system board would benefit from longer member terms, required expertise in additional areas, and a greater number of impartial board members. The health system should keep its current authority structure, where it's separate from VCU, and steps should be taken to protect the important and mutually beneficial collaboration between the health system and VCU. Mr. Chairman, I have 6 sections to my presentation this morning, and this briefing is a bit longer than usual because all of our findings are included in the slides that you have. There isn't a separate written report, as Hal mentioned. That means that I'll have to skip over some slides and sections, and I'll let you know when I do so that you can follow along. That said, I am happy to answer any questions that you have on any of the materials that I don't cover this morning. Now I'll provide you with some background information on the health system. The VCU health system has several statutory responsibilities. They're listed on this slide and are related to providing health care and supporting VCU's health sciences programs, which include medical research and training. As you can see in the map on slide 8, the health system has inpatient and outpatient facilities across the state, not just in Richmond, though many are clustered in central Virginia. Slide 9 has a few data points that show the large volume of patients the health system serves, including low-income patients. And that's important because providing indigent care is a key part of the health system's purpose, and it also affects the health system's ability to generate revenue. The next few slides provide more insight into the health system's finances, but I'll skip over them for the sake of time. The key takeaway is that the health system has about $3 billion in operating revenue annually. Now on slide 12, one important thing to note about the health system is that it's an authority that is legally separate from VCU. The hospitals, physician group, and treatment center for children are part of the health system, while the health sciences programs and research facilities are under the purview of VCU. The health system was granted authority status in the 1990s to help it compete with other Richmond healthcare providers. In practice, being an authority allows the health system to be more nimble on things like personnel and procurement. Although the health system and VCU are legally separate, there is some overlap between them when it comes to leadership and board members. The health system has a board of directors and is led by a CEO who oversees health system operations. The university has a board of visitors and is led by a president. The overlap comes into play first at the board level, with 5 members who are on both boards. Then at the leadership level, the health system CEO is also the senior vice president for health sciences at VCU, which is like a provost. The VCU president is also the president of the health system and the chair of the health system board of directors. And I know that's a lot to digest, but I'll reference the boards and the leadership structures of both entities a few times this morning.
Can I ask you a question about that? Are they, the CEOs, are they voting members of these boards?
The CEO, SVP of the health system, is currently a voting member of the board of directors.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, and Mr. Chairman, that was a good time for questions. I'll pause here quickly to answer any others before moving on.
Yes, Delegate Wilt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good. Is that one?
Good.
Okay, thank you. So I'm curious about slide 11. So we often hear about how low reimbursements from Medicaid affect negatively facilities and so forth, but yet we see this, and in spite of that, things they maintain a positive economic outlook, I guess we can say. How's that? I mean, that goes contrary to everything that we hear and understand, or at least for me.
Delegate, that's a good question. And when we spoke with health system staff about that, we were told that the Medicare and Medicaid services they provide, those are services that they typically don't make any money on. They're lucky to break even. But they do also have commercial payers. And so those individuals, the services they provide to them, that's where they are able to generate some revenue. And it just sounds like a lot of very prudent financial monitoring is necessary and really results in the strong bond ratings they have now.
Delegate Wilt, there's a slide later on that talks about their payer mix. And the payer mix, while not great, I guess, is a lot better than many rural hospitals have. They have more commercial payers than the hospitals out in rural Virginia. I think that's a correct statement.
Mr. Chair, I'd probably defer to the health system to get into the details of their payer mix, but we have been told that they have a higher proportion of low-income patients than a lot of hospitals.
We have a rural select committee on rural health care now, and some of these rural hospitals have payer mix like only 20% commercial payers, 15, 20%, 25%, and VCU is a lot higher than that. Thank you.
I believe that's right, and I think we might have a number. I'm going to look at my team and see if we have that breakdown. I know there are a few different ways to report payer mix, so we don't have numbers for all the systems, but I believe.
Mr. Chairman? But on slide 11, bullet 2 says a lower portion of commercial payers than other area health systems.
Doug Wilt, that's true for the Richmond metro area.
Okay. Yeah, that's
right. But maybe you could tell us about, I know VCU Health System has 2 rural hospitals. I mean, they're doing work out where we need it, and there's a scarcity of resources, and they probably have a worse payer mix than you have in Richmond. I'm just guessing, but that's, people have wealthier people have insurance. Yes, ma'am.
I'm not sure that this sheds any light on Delegate Wilt's question, but overall, in terms of their revenue, about half of their revenue is generated from Medicaid and Medicare. And so the other half is commercial payers, essentially. And when you think about the spread between the cost and what those commercial payers are paying, that does allow them to generate the types of revenues that we're talking about. So that the slide here is talking about the primary source of state funding is Medicaid, but it certainly is not the primary source of all of their funding.
Anybody else? Okay, please continue.
Okay, now I'll share a few slides on system structure. And to define that a bit for you, the system structure is how the health system is organized, relative to the university. For example, the health system is an affiliated but legally separate authority compared to VCU. In 2023, a consultant concluded that the health system board becoming a subsidiary that is I'm sorry, I skipped ahead one slide. On slide 15, the key finding in this section is that there isn't sufficient evidence for us to recommend changing the health system's current authority structure, even though some stakeholders may be interested in doing so. And now on slide 16, in 2023, a consultant concluded that the health system becoming a subsidiary that is further integrated with VCU would best position both entities for long-term success. However, changing the health system structure in that way does not appear to be warranted based on our research. Such a change would be most advantageous to VCU, and a review of other academic health systems did not suggest there is a clear best structure for health systems. Given that there's no ideal system structure, the question then becomes, how can the health system make the most out of their current authority structure? The way things are now, the overlap between the health system and VCU has benefits, but it also creates some challenges. Some overlap is beneficial because of the entity's shared missions, but making decisions in the best interest of the health system can be difficult when VCU's interests are too heavily represented. We have several recommendations for you in the remainder of this briefing that would help clarify the roles and responsibilities of the health system under the current authority structure and VCU. Our recommendations would accomplish a few things, including help ensure VCU has an appropriate level of input into health system decisions, and improve the health system's staffing and board structure. Mr. Chairman, I know that was a short section, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
I don't see anybody with their hand up, so please continue.
Okay, now I'll cover a few slides on the health system's Clay Street project and recent improvements. There's been a lot of press coverage, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Clay Street capital project. To summarize things at a fairly high level, the Clay Street project was a lease that the health system signed with a developer in 2021 for planned office space, parking, and retail space. The project would have gone on a site owned by the city of Richmond that VCU and the health system had wanted to acquire for a long time because of its location. The project was halted in 2022 before construction began because the developer said it could not be done within the agreed upon budget after the lease was signed. The key reasons were poor site conditions and construction cost increases. All the parties involved, the health system, city, and developer, couldn't agree on a revised version of the project, so the health system signed a defeasance agreement to get out of the lease in early 2023. Continuing with the project would have constrained the health system's future revenues and ability to invest in other projects, according to staff. Stopping the project ultimately cost the health system about $80 million up front. Additional costs are expected because the health system agreed to pay the city annually to make up for taxes that would have been collected for the project. Although Clay Street was just one capital project, it highlighted several shortcomings in the health system's capital project process and governance structure. To mention a couple, leadership agreed to a lease where all of the risk was on the health system. And despite the risks known to at least 2 board members, the board did not reconsider the project. The project also raised questions about the level of influence VCU has over health system decisions. For the Clay Street project, the health system's former CEO raised concerns about project risk before signing the lease. He had the authority to decline signing the lease, but he sought direction from the VCU president. The VCU president, who was also the health system board chair and president, directed VCU's former CFO to analyze project risks. The CFO and another member of the president's cabinet strongly advised the health system CEO to sign the lease. The health system has made changes following the Clay Street project. They revised their capital project process, implemented a risk assessment policy for significant capital projects, and strengthened the health system's board's conflict of interest policy and procedures. Still, a few additional changes would be beneficial, and I'll cover those in the next few sections. But before I move on, Mr. Chair, I'll pause here.
Any questions?
Mr. Chair.
Yep, Delegate Rasul.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Just a quick question. I noticed in one of your recommendations that you're recommending eliminating the health system president position. My question is, I was trying to, in your previous slides, how was the president involved here as you were going through the flow?
Delegate, is your question about the president's involvement in our research process?
Correct.
Thank you for that question, Delegate. We did work very closely with VCU leadership and health system leadership during our research, interviewed key leadership figures a number of times, including the president. And for that particular recommendation, it is something we asked the president about, and that is something that he has publicly stated he would support no longer being in the position of the health system president.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
Go-
McDougal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back to, I guess it's page 23, I know I've heard some questions this week. I think many of us assume that the $2.5 million annually is a payment in lieu of taxes. Is that your understanding of what it is, or is it your understanding that it's a assumption of the developer's contracted duties to VCU?
Senator McDougal, it is our assumption that that payment is the payment in lieu of taxes and something that the health system had agreed to pay even at the beginning of the project when it was being developed. That payment was something that the developer passed on, basically, and the health system agreed to take over that financial obligation.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
So one additional question. I see in your sheet that VCU is paid to the city $5 million for the demolition of what I guess we called the public safety building historically. And how much have they paid so far of those in lieu of taxes amounts?
Senator, I'm going to look over to my team to see if we know what the total is so far.
Senator, I believe that
Can you please introduce yourself?
Good morning. My name is Dylan Wild. I'm an analyst on the team. And Senator, thank you for the question. Our understanding is that they have made at least one payment in lieu of taxes so far and are currently working to determine the future of those payments following the direction in the budget.
So, Mr. Chairman, so my understanding said that would be $7.5 million to the city so far, if you count the demolition of the old building and the one payment in lieu of taxes.
Yes, sir.
And, Mr. Chairman, one follow-up.
Please continue.
And do I understand the city retains ownership of the property? It is.
Yes, Senator, that's correct.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. Anybody else? Okay, moving right along then.
Okay. Now I'll share some information from our assessment of the health system's current capital project process. The health system does a large amount of capital projects, spending about $1 billion in the last 5 years alone on capital. Slide 27 lists the major projects since 2020, if you're interested. We looked at some information on past capital projects that cost more than $5 million since fiscal year 20, and the good news is they were completed on time and within the approved budgets. Looking at the substance of the health system's new capital project process, it incorporates many industry best practices. The next couple of slides explain what a capital project process should have and what has been lacking historically at the health system. But I'm going to jump ahead to slide 32. This slide shows the health system's new capital project process. There's a lot to read, but at a high level, the process is rigorous and standardized. There are 6 steps that start with strategic planning and also include project prioritization, budget development, and board approval. Importantly, there are multiple off-ramps shown at the bottom of the figure in red, where the health system can stop a project at different stages of the process if significant issues are identified.
Ms. Axel, this is something that every university should use, or every agency that are planning capital. So this is something that everyone would be familiar with.
Mr. Chairman, I think the specifics do vary by health system on exactly how they do this, but this did seem to align with all the industry best practices and with best practices when we spoke with other health systems.
And Mr. Chair,
Yeah,
these best
Senator-
practices
Senator Deeb.
were implemented when? Over what period of time?
Senator, I believe it was in the past year, though I'm going to look at my team to make sure I'm correct on that.
So, Mr. Chair, since the Clay Street building agreement?
Yes, Senator.
Anybody else? Okay.
Okay. In addition to the new process, the health system also has new policy requiring detailed information on significant capital projects. So before the board reviews a potential project, staff have to document a number of things, including all the different types of risk a project may have, how the project relates to the health system strategic plan and mission, how the project will be funded, and any conflicts of interest. Health system board members are satisfied with the information they now receive on capital projects, though it's important to remember that the new process has only been in place for a short time.
Okay.
Something we identified in our research is that although the health system needs to complete numerous major capital projects in the future to sustain and expand its operations, it currently lacks a long-term strategy for prioritizing and sequencing these projects. There are various projects the health system could pursue in the next decade to advance its mission. Funding is limited, so they can't all be done at the same time. A long-term capital strategy is needed to help deal with the number and complexity of the health system's capital project needs. The health system already has several different planning documents, which are shown in the table on slide 37, but it does not currently have a system-wide major capital strategy plan.
Can I ask you a question here? So is it all their fault that they don't have this? Because we have the six, what do you call it, the GAP 6 or whatever that gets together. We have staff that ask for plans every year. We fund things through a process upstairs. And I'm surprised that there's no long-term capital planning when we think we have something that looks like that in appropriations.
Mr. Chairman, that's a good question, and there is a distinction here. VCU does have a major capital plan. So on the university side, they do have a plan that frankly looks like a good model. On the health system side, though, however, which is a separate entity, that the long-term system-wide facilities plan is something that they have been discussing since we've been doing our research. It sounds like something they would like to work on. The board has been asking questions, but they have not had that as of yet.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Senator Deeds.
About the same time we set up the VCU health system as a separate entity, we did the same thing for the University of Virginia. Do you have any idea whether you've got the same problem brewing at UVA?
Senator Deeds, when we spoke with VCU officials, their health system staff, about their capital plan, it does sound like they have a plan, but because it's all one entity, that is part of what the broader university does as well.
Yeah, these two systems are not the same, Senator Deeds. This is an authority, and there is no authority at UVA. Yep. It's all within the university system. So, please continue.
Okay. Without a plan, there's a lack of consensus among board members about what the top capital needs are. That was fairly evident in the survey responses we got from board members when we asked them what the number one capital need is for the health system. Some said expanding the inpatient capacity in the downtown medical center, but others cited different priorities. Board members told us they want additional clarity on the health system's capital priorities. A long-term strategic facilities plan can help align capital projects with system needs and priorities. Ideally, it should be a multi-year plan that prioritizes projects based on mission, needs, finances, and risks. We found a few other health systems with this type of plan. So we have a recommendation on slide 40 for the health system to develop a 10-year strategic capital plan. Another finding I want to share related to capital projects is that the health system currently lacks sufficient leadership and staff capacity in key capital project functions. The health system has had a lot of staffing changes in recent years in its capital project functions. The key takeaway from this slide is that key staff who used to work on real estate and capital projects at the health system are no longer there, and project management is no longer contracted out, so there are some staffing gaps. Last year, the health system piloted a program where they used VCU staff to help fill capital project staffing gaps, but the program had some drawbacks. For example, VCU staff did not have full knowledge of health systems functions or health system construction needs. There were also some questions about legal risks since VCU and the health system are separate entities. Given the size and complexity of the health system's capital projects, it seems necessary for it to have a dedicated capital project leadership and staff group going forward. A few other health systems we interviewed have leadership positions focused on capital, as well as internal teams that are fairly robust for planning, procuring, and managing capital projects. Therefore, we recommend that the health system have director-level positions overseeing construction and real estate functions that report to a health system executive and develop the staffing capacity necessary within the health system for capital projects. I do want to note here that the health system has already made some progress on this front. They recently filled a director of construction project management position and also created a new director of real estate position. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to skip ahead to slide 52 so we can move into our findings on executive leadership, but there is another finding and recommendation in this section if you're interested.
Let's skip ahead. How about that?
And with that, I will pause here for any questions.
Yeah. I have a question, but I don't want to take up any time. I don't want to take up any more time. Yeah, please continue.
Next is our section on the health system's executive leadership. As I mentioned a bit earlier, there is some crossover between executive leadership at the health system and VCU. Focusing first at the president level, the VCU president holds several key health system roles. In addition to leading the university, the VCU president is the health system board chair and the health system president. The position also has a tie-breaking vote for employment decisions concerning the health system CEO, which is laid out in statute. While some VCU input into health system decisions is important, given the shared mission of the entities, the VCU president's health system leadership roles create the potential for that position to have too much influence on health system operations and decisions. The VCU president's health system roles are influential ones. For example, the VCU president's role as health system board chair is permanent, and it allows the president to sit on all health system board committees, including the committee that evaluates and determines the health system CEO's compensation. As president of the health system, the VCU president works closely with the health system CEO to help facilitate compatible decision-making between the two entities. The president of the health system is not supposed to supersede the CEO, but the role is supposed to help coordinate strategy between the two entities. The VCU president is not supposed to be the ultimate decision maker at the health system, but that's difficult in practice because there's a bit of a human element here. The health system CEO has statutory authority over health system operations, but the CEO reports to the VCU president in both the health system and VCU org charts. The structure can lead to the health system decisions being influenced by VCU interests. With Clay Street, for example, the CEO signed a lease he had concerns about after being advised to do so by members of the VCU president's cabinet who believed they were carrying out the president's priorities. We thought a lot about the health system's leadership structure and collected a variety of perspectives on it. Multiple stakeholders think the VCU president position should have fewer health system roles. The majority of health system board members agreed that the VCU president should no longer be the health system board chair, no longer have a vote on the health system board, and that the health system president position should be eliminated. The current VCU president has publicly supported the idea of no longer being the board chair or the health system president. So, Mr. Chairman, we have 3 recommendations for you that would change the VCU president's position's leadership roles at the health system. First recommendation is to amend statute so the VCU president becomes a non-voting member of the health system board and cannot serve as the board chair. Second recommendation is to amend statute to require the health system board to elect a chair who is not a health system employee, VCU employee, or VCU board member. And the third recommendation is to eliminate the health system president position, making the CEO the top health system executive who reports to the health system board. And the next two slides mention the VCU president's tiebreaker role in employment decisions for the health system CEO. We also recommend eliminating that as well, which would require statutory change, but I'll click over those slides for the sake of time.
For those of us a little bit slower, can you, if we did this, wouldn't they be like two completely different separate entities? They would be, but there's a role that the health sciences, this is a teaching hospital, and they have nursing and all kinds of allied health instruction and dental school, pharmacy school.
Mr. Chairman, that's a really important question. If these changes were made, it would not change the legal separation that already exists between the two entities. It would just further reflect the structure that's already in place. But the point you mentioned about the crossover is extremely important and something that we heard loud and clear from staff at the health system and VCU. And that's the reason we have a few recommendations to preserve that communication and collaboration between the two entities. Just skipping forward to a few slides, we have one that would put some language in statute, basically stating that they need to continue to work together for each other's mutual interests. We also have some other recommendations that would get at keeping the top leadership positions working together, and also some board changes too.
Okay, members, Senator Locke.
You just said it, so I guess I'll just wait until you show that. What does this mean for the boards?
Very good question, Senator Locke. And if you're okay with waiting just a few moments, it'll be towards the end of the briefing. I do have a recommendation on that. Okay. So we are now on slide 62. The remaining findings and recommendations I have in this leadership section are about the health system CEO position. The CEO currently has a dual role and also serves as the VCU SVP of Health Sciences. After looking into the advantages and disadvantages of this structure, we concluded that having the same individual in both roles assigns a lot of responsibilities to one person, makes the position difficult to fill, and creates the potential for too much VCU influence over the health system. Having a combined CEO-SVP role is meant to support coordination between the health system and VCU. This can be beneficial in areas of mutual interest, like duly employed physicians and students participating in patient care. It can also reduce the risk of turf wars between the health system and the academic enterprise. However, there are several noteworthy disadvantages. At the VCU's health system, the combined role oversees 18 individuals, which creates a risk that not all areas receive the necessary level of attention. There are also different skill sets for each role. The CEO needs experience running a large, complex organization and an understanding of finance, human resources, and other business functions. The SVP needs experience with academic leadership and research. A combined CEO-SVP role also opens doors for too much VCU influence over health system decisions, because the SVP reports up through the VCU president and still has that perspective when making health system decisions. When we consulted health system board members about the CEO-SVP role, the majority said that the roles should be split. Statute currently allows the CEO-SVP roles to be combined or split, but a change would be needed if the positions are split to require the health system CEO to be on the health system board. Right now, the SVP is one of the ex officio voting members of the board, and that's meant that the CEO has been on the board in practice because the CEO-SVP has been the same person. Going forward, though, if the positions are split, the CEO should retain a seat on the board so health system leadership is represented. So we have two recommendations. The first is that the health system and VCU should split the CEO and SVP roles into two positions. And the second is that statute should be amended to require the health system CEO to be an ex officio voting member of the health system board. Now, the health system will need to ensure the CEO and SVP maintain a positive working relationship after the positions are split. And this gets at your question, Mr. Chairman. This is key for academic medical centers and requires hiring collaborative people into those positions. The next few slides provide more detail on that, but I'll skip straight to the recommendations for time. So on slide 70, we have 2 recommendations to help ensure an effective working relationship between the CEO and SVP specifically. I won't read through them, but they're here for your review. Mr. Chairman, the next few slides dive into yet another layer of leadership where we recommend that the health system reduces the CEO's number of direct reports and consolidates similar functions under a COO and a new CAO position. But I'll move on to slide 76. I know I've covered a lot of ground in that leadership section, so I'll pause here for any questions.
Well, if I have a question, and maybe you would want to answer this later, but we have another big hospital up in Charlottesville, and the head of the UVA health system is the president of the university, ultimately. The head of the health system works for the president. But you're not recommending that for VCU. So if this is important to separate the two, why wouldn't you want to separate them at all 4 of our medical schools?
Mr. Chairman, the UVA model is an interesting one and something that, was contemplated with that consultant review I mentioned earlier. It's just a different system structure. UVA's is integrated. Right now, the health system is a separate authority. That's not to say that the health system couldn't consider moving to a model more like UVA's, but there are a number of drawbacks and considerations, financial, governance-wise, that were emphasized to us, and also concerns about removing some of the flexibility that the health system currently has under its authority status. So for us, the bar was pretty high to recommend changing their system structure, and we just didn't have enough evidence to say that that's how it should look. So instead, we tried to focus on ways to make sure their current authority structure could be maximized and the roles between the 2 entities could be as clear as possible.
Okay. This is the final slide here coming up.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this is my last section, and it is on the Health System Board. The Health System Board of Directors, or BOD, currently has 21 members, most of whom are appointed by political entities, including the Governor, House, Senate, and VCU Board of Visitors Rector. The figure on slide 77 shows the breakout of all the appointments and the requirements appointing entities must adhere to, such as appointing a certain number of physician members. Board members currently serve for 3-year terms, and we have a recommendation to increase that to 4-year terms so members have more time to learn the complexities of the health system. But I'm going to jump to our findings on slide 82. One takeaway from our research on the Health System Board is that members need expertise in areas that are not currently specified in statute to provide meaningful oversight. Statute currently requires Health System Board members to have expertise in business, healthcare management, or legal affairs, but these areas are too broad and key skill sets are not guaranteed. More specific skill sets would be beneficial. Specifically, real estate and finance expertise. These are both essential for health systems to achieve strategic objectives. Commercial real estate expertise would help VCU's health system as it acquires more land, enters into leases, and commits to doing more construction. Finance expertise would give the health system more support to navigate all the complexities of a $3 billion entity and to maintain strong bond ratings. Some board members currently do have these areas of expertise, but they are not guaranteed long-term. Therefore, we recommend amending statute to add commercial real estate and finance to the existing list of expertise requirements for health system board members. Ideally, the board should also have members with experience leading large health systems, but these individuals can be difficult to attract to board service. When they are found, they can be extremely helpful resources. because they know the right questions to ask and the things to be looking out for in health system governance, according to stakeholders that we spoke with. The code already has this expertise requirement, so no statutory change is needed. But we do have a recommendation for the health system to hire an expert to examine the best ways to attract these individuals to the board. Our next finding is about the types of members who serve on the health system board. Current membership requirements mean that a majority of members hold professional roles at VCU or specific departments of the health system, which can make it difficult for board members to act in the best interest of the health system at large. These membership requirements also make the board too large. In terms of board member interests, statute and health systems and the health systems bylaws have restrictions for addressing conflicts of interest. I won't read through the slide, but the takeaway is that the health system board members have a fiduciary role to only consider the health system's best interests. And there can be potential conflicts of interest when members have other interests that may influence them. The health systems board, the current membership of the health system board does create the potential that some members may not prioritize the interests of the whole health system. 12 out of the 21 board members are at risk of this, with 7 bringing a VCU perspective and 5 bringing a department-specific health system perspective. Members have inherent conflicts of interest that are impossible to comprehensively identify. That's because, to some extent, all financial and strategic decisions of the health system have implications for VCU and specific health system departments. The legislature could better safeguard health system interests by making sure that a majority of board members are selected based on their expertise rather than their ties to VCU or status as physicians. In addition to increasing the risk for potential conflicts, the large number of VCU and health system affiliated members makes the health system board unnecessarily large. And that has all the effects you might imagine. It can reduce member engagement and make it more difficult for staff to correspond with the members. The average health system board size, according to a national survey, is 16 members. For all these reasons, we have a recommendation to amend statute to reduce the size of the health system board so a majority of members do not have professional roles at VCU or the health system. The board should still have a few voting members who represent VCU and health system physicians, just not a majority. You'll notice that this recommendation does not specify exactly what the board membership should be, and that's because there are many ways that this recommendation could be accomplished, and it's a bit of a policy decision. But we do have an example of what the revised board could look like on slide 94. Mr. Chairman, I have one final finding. This gets to what change could be made at the board level to help ensure collaboration and communication going forward. And that's really important because communication and collaboration with VCU does contribute to the health system's strong financial position, and it can be supported at the board level. Communication and collaboration between the health system and VCU is currently effective. That is something we heard loud and clear. Multiple efforts have been made over the years to make sure the entities work together, and their good working relationship has been key to favorable bond ratings. Our recommendations should not jeopardize that. Back in the executive leadership section, you remember the recommendations that we had to support communication and collaboration between the CEO and SVP. And in this section, we're focusing on how that can be accomplished at the board level. And we think it's important for it to be accomplished there, and could do so by creating a joint health system and VCU committee. Permanent joint committee could provide updates on key strategic, operational, and financial matters of both entities. Committee membership could include key health system and VCU executives, as well as a subset of health system board and VCU BOV members. And here's the recommendation that lays all that out on slide 98. Mr. Chairman, in closing, I'll leave you with this slide. This change to the board and all the other changes that I've discussed this morning are things we strongly feel will help the health system, especially as it works towards renovating its downtown medical center campus. Looking forward, that effort will involve a lot of capital projects and the need for leadership to make important decisions on behalf of the health system. And I'm happy to answer any additional questions.
Members, questions? A lot of information here, a lot to take in.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Senator McDougall.
On page 94, I noticed with that removing 2 physician members, did y'all discuss at all the benefit of having 1 member from the nursing profession? That seems to be an area that is a focus and key to how the entire system operates. Any conversations about that?
Senator McDougall, that was not something that specifically came up in our discussions of the board membership, but it sounds like it could be something that's considered, certainly if changes are made to the board composition. What we heard loud and clear is that physician representation on the board is an important perspective so that the board does hear feedback on how things are working on the ground.
Follow up? You can. No, Senator Pike.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a follow-up question, going back about 100 pages. Appreciate your work on this, but the payment in lieu of taxes, is there other precedents in regards to similar systems paying payment in lieu of taxes around the Commonwealth?
Senator McPike, we did not hear of any examples in our interactions with other health systems of any sort of payment like that. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it's not something that any of the other health systems we spoke about kind of discussed the challenges with taxation.
Follow, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Pike.
I presume it wasn't in the scope of study to understand overall VCU, both campus and health systems, or frankly just the health system's impact on Richmond's budget in terms of contributions overall, in terms of visitors, hotel occupancy tax, meals, and like the long list of other taxes that the system contributes to Richmond.
Senator McPike, that's correct. That was not something we looked at.
Sure, and thank you for this report. And I assure you, we're not going to take it personally that you don't think any General Assembly member should be on the board. So,
Mr. Chairman, I do want to clarify here on slide 94, that top sub-bullet within the 9 members would be the 2 legislative members. Interestingly enough, when we looked at how this is laid out in statute, when the House and Senate appoint members, it's not specified that they have to be non-legislative members. So traditionally, you have had representation from both the House and the Senate. It's just not specified that a set number have to be legislative members. So we have a little footnote in there.
so we will have our nurses and if we have another doctor, will fit the bill if they're legislators too. You get a twofer, right? That's what you're saying.
I think there are a lot of different ways that this could be done, certainly.
Okay, but it's based on expertise, so. Some of us feel like we're expert on these things. Just kidding. So thank you. And any further questions of Ms. Axel? Yes.
This overhaul of the board, as recommended here, certainly cannot take place until there is some legislative action, correct?
That's correct. That's our understanding, Senator. Yes.
Okay. Well, we have a special guest here today, President Rao, who's going to give us some remarks. He's read this thing and listened to all the debate and been an active participant in all this, and we're interested in. We want to know if you think legislators are helpful.
At least a long-term participant at this point. And good morning. I think it's still morning. Yes. Chair Sickles and Vice Chair Locke, thank you so much, members of the JLARC, for the opportunity to share our perspective and thoughts on the study of ECU Health's capital process and governance structure. So our team would also like to thank Director Greer and your entire team for the work that you've done and the opportunity to interact with the staff. With the capital process, I'll start out with that. There's a particular focus on Clay Street, and we all regret that the result wasn't what anyone wanted. But I will say that the buck stops with me as chair of the Health System Board of Directors. Trying to acquire the adjacent public safety building and property was really something that was important to VCU Health for a very, very long time. We all recognized it because of its adjacency as the front door of the medical center. When project concerns were raised, as chair, I believed that they were legitimate, and I said so in several different ways. I asked the former VCU Health CEO to work with available university leadership at that time in July of 2021 because the health system's chief legal officer and the chief financial officer positions became vacant within just days of each other in July of 2021. I also asked, and I was 5,000 miles away, by the way, I also asked that the chair of the Health System Board of Directors Finance Committee be involved, and along with other board members, I suggested that others be involved. When it was reported back to me, however, that the meetings went well and the agreement had been signed, I believed that any concerns that existed had been resolved. After a confluence of many post-pandemic issues, including site conditions that I had heard came up and continue to come up from what I hear, national economic pressures, including things like inflation, it made the project impossible, and the VCU Health Board of Directors unanimously voted to end the project. We all knew at that time that it was a very difficult decision, and this was a discussion that occurred over many, many meetings with many, many people. It was also the right decision because it avoided far greater future financial liabilities, including what we had been advised could be a likely downgrade of the health system's bond ratings. Today, VCU Health has a strong bond credit rating, partly because of this decision, and we know that because we've discussed this with both major credit rating agencies. We've maintained AA bond ratings, and we now have stable outlooks determined by both. Last year, I asked VCU Health and VCU Board of Visitors, as a matter of fact, to commission 2 independent reports from national experts about governance and best practices at university-based academic health systems. Those reports and thousands of pages of records relating to the project have been widely shared. Today's report reinforces much of the previously released information, and many of the JLARC staff's recommendations were implemented last year, and I'll just share a couple of those with you. Strengthening VCU Health's 10-year strategic capital plan is something the board is very engaged in. I'm at every board meeting, so I get to be a part of that and see that. Creating a significant transaction policy and engagement process for the board has occurred. We are now retaining third-party advisors on multiple levels, ensuring that there are no conflicts, by the way, as well, for high-profile or high-dollar transactions, and establishing project management teams and strong project due diligence, along with, as Lauren shared with you, the need to put the proper director-level staff in place. So another thing that Lauren shared with you is in keeping very much with what I shared publicly last September. I very much support updating the roles of the VCU president and VCU Health board chair. These are roles that a lot of my colleagues, regardless of the structure around the nation, do not share with me. I don't know of anyone else who serves as VCU or the university's president and the health system's president at the same time. And if you look at our bylaws, you'll see that, as Lauren pointed out, it is a coordinating role anyhow. But it is a confusing thing to have out there, in my opinion. Additionally, I believe that the board members who are appointed should be appointed based on their expertise that the health system has to have as a multi-billion-dollar health system. As for other recommendations per the staff's instructions, which Director Greer, I think, very well articulated reasons for why, which we understand completely, that we did not share this report with the VCU Health Board of Directors or with the VCU Board of Visitors. Some of the recommendations, however, I know are going to require both boards' deep consideration and discussion about how these recommendations could fundamentally affect the relationship between the health system and the university. And I believe both boards are interested in that and see that value. Some of the complexities are outlined in our letter that accompanies the report. I anticipate that both boards will begin pretty deep dialogue very soon now that the report is public. VCU Health, I just remind you, because I've been around for 15 years, it really is unlike any other health system in Virginia, maybe with the exception of UVA. We are the two major academic medical centers. We do things that other health systems cannot do, largely driven by research, largely driven by having physician scientist faculty who do things that a lot of other physicians cannot do in other health systems. And like our sister institution at UVA, VCU Health, really, and sometimes we do it together, VCU Health and UVA, we align emerging university-based research with really what I can tell you and attest to is really life-saving care for patients. And we foster advancements in medical science and innovative treatments that other health systems just aren't and cannot do. So this university-based academic mission is combined with VCU Health's role, as well as Lauren pointed out, because we are also the largest safety net provider in the state, which we appreciate the state's support of. There's not another health system like this in terms of also combining tertiary and quaternary care. Dr. Levy, our CEO, is here with me today. He is a transplantation surgeon. He can tell you that many of the things he does are not able to happen in other health systems. And of course, the largest safety net responsibility is quite significant. So keeping these essential missions in mind, and the patients and the communities who we take care of, these are critical things going forward. And I really do look forward to the Board of Directors and the Board of Visitors reviewing these recommendations in the coming weeks, is my anticipation. With that, I conclude my response and very much appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming and being relatively brief here. Do we have any questions? Okay. Yeah.
Mr. Chair, I've got a lot of questions about the agreement. I'm not sure if right now is the appropriate time to ask all the questions.
Right.
There was an $80 million payment to get out of this deal, and there's still the in lieu of tax payment. I don't think there's ever been a contract like that for a public entity.
Yes, and as I understand it, when we made the decision to defease those bonds and end that project, there was about $73 million that was absorbed by the investors and developers of that project. None of that money went to VCU or VCU Health.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Senator McPike.
Yeah, I'm just curious if your legal team has done follow-up under 58.13203 in terms of certain leasehold taxations and exemptions, and whether or not it's actually applicable or legal to apply the 2.5 annual payment in lieu of.
I'm sorry.
The provisions of tax exemption have limited provisions under leases as they pass through taxable entities through leaseholds. And so I'm not sure it's actually legal to pay or collect it to Richmond, since there's no holding interest of a non-tax exempt entity. It does not exist. You don't have the hold of a lease or beneficial use of the property, therefore it's not taxable.
Oh, I see what you're saying. And I do believe that's something that Dr. Levy, our CEO, is very much engaged in thinking with his team about right now, as well as others with counsel.
Do you have lawyers, your agreement, a lawyer looked at this and signed off on the payment in lieu of taxes?
There are attorneys involved now. Maybe Dr. Levy, you could, as the operator of the health system.
Yeah, thank you, President. Mr. Chairman, Marlon Levy, interim CEO of the health system, and members of the commission. The agreement for piloting new taxes at the time was reviewed by our internal legal team and by external counsel as well. On the question of whether this is a legal thing to do, that's currently under review.
So somebody thinks it's legal.
Sir?
Somebody thinks it's legal, or you wouldn't have entered into it. I mean, lawyers have fights all the time. I watch them. And
so you speak in the present tense. I'll speak in the past tense. I think at the time that this was agreed to, it was felt to be correct to do that.
Okay, so it's an outstanding issue, though.
I think, but I would say in the present tense, that's being reviewed.
I see.
And why we're currently in conversations with the city about that very topic.
Thank you. Well, more to come on that. Anybody else? Well, thank you.
Great.
Good luck
thank you very
going
much,
forward
Mr.
here.
Chair.
A lot of stuff for us to absorb, and I'm sure the members are all free to introduce bills, so look out.
Yes,
sir. There might be, and there are a lot of people watching on the internet too, maybe.
And as with the JLARC staff, you can expect us to be fully cooperative in every way.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Enjoy your testimony.
Thank you so much.
Good morning, Justin. Can you introduce yourself?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. My name is Justin Brown. I'm one of JLARC's associate directors, and we had planned for 15 minutes, but I see we are behind, so I'm going to
We're behind by 35 minutes.
If you're okay, stop me if we are going too fast. I do want to thank the Secretary's office and the VDOT commissioners, his staff, for their help on this. They were very cooperative and were very good to work with. Just as a reminder, this was something directed by the commission last year, and you can see the specific topics here on the slide. Really briefly, we took a look at tolling in Northern Virginia, and it seems like it's generally understandable, but there are some inconsistencies that may be causing some confusion for drivers. That third item there, we've identified a few lessons learned that might be instructive the next time the state enters into a P3. And we looked into the I-81 improvement plan, and there's been progress, but it's probably going to make sense to reevaluate things a few years down the road. So let's start with tolling. Here's just some background on tolling, pointing out the two different types of tolled roads in Virginia. There are flat fee tolls and dynamically priced tolls. This is just a map for your reference of the various tolled roads in Northern Virginia. And when we were asked this question about understandability, we thought really the best way to get at it was just ask drivers directly. So we surveyed a sample of them, and we started with a really big picture question. And based on that big picture question, it does not look like difficulty understanding toll roads is among the main reasons why people don't use toll roads. You can see in that bottom bar there, the biggest reason folks said they don't use them is because of the cost. So most of the Easy Pass holders we surveyed did understand the concept of dynamic pricing. And on slide 10, we're just showing that, drivers generally can navigate the lanes, but when it got to express lanes, a pretty high percentage of them reported at least, it was somewhat difficult to navigate these express lanes. Another area of, I guess I'd say, less than full understanding was HOV lane usage. So there's three things you have to do to kind of correctly use an HOV lane, and those are listed on the slide there. And you can see that only 44% of people who had Easy Passes and had driven in that area understood all three requirements to use an HOV lane. And the least understood requirement was that on the bottom of the special transponder, you have to click it to on. So in terms of the signs on the tolled roads that are displaying the prices, particularly in a way that drivers can understand, you can see that 83%, when we showed them a picture on the survey of an actual sign, they got the price right. But for some of the drivers, we actually showed them a video at driving speed of the sign, and you can see that dropped down to only 56% of the drivers getting that right. Now, that is completely intuitive and makes perfect sense, but just kind of an important reference point that folks are trying to read these signs when they're driving down the road. So just briefly, in terms of understandability, there's obviously more out there than just the signage. Here we're just summarizing what both VDOT and the operators do. They put out a variety of information to try to make that information available to drivers. On slide 14, just want to make you aware that toll operators are required to comply with signage requirements in a federal manual. And VDOT also requires the operators to submit a signage plan, and that signage plan is approved. Now, what's been interesting is the state has done business with more operators over time. There's different signage depending on where you are up in Northern Virginia. And so here we're just showing an example of the two main types of signs. One used by the operator that's been in Virginia for quite a while, and the one on the bottom is used by a relatively new operator in Virginia. So as we did our research, it became clear that consistency is pretty important. And although VDOT can't force these operators to use similar signage in the near term, we do have a recommendation that moving forward to require consistent signage. And at the bottom, we're just showing an example if the VDOT were to proceed with a particular kind of extension along 495, that the signage should be the same as what's already used along that particular roadway. So let me stick with two more Northern Virginia topics, if I might. On slide 18, we looked into how vehicles with more than 2 axles are handled across the various tolled roads in Virginia. And it turns out there actually is quite a bit of variation, and I think potential confusion across the different tolled roads and how larger vehicles are handled. That bottom slide, the bottom table there is just an example of the charges by axle on 2 different tolled roads. And I think one thing to just point out, you can kind of see how this might be confusing going back to the signage consistency issue. On the left are just some examples of signage used to show trucks or other large vehicles are prohibited. If you look on the bottom right, that's just an example of the sign that lays out the different rates by number of axles depending on the time of day. So last Northern Virginia specific topic, as I'm sure you know if you live in and around that region, the Occoquan Bridge is among the most heavily congested parts of I-95. Literally millions of hours of lost time due to sitting in traffic. And what's interesting here is the state signed a P3 contract back in 2012. And the way it's structured, the state has to pay penalties to the operator if the state builds any projects that are proven to divert traffic away from the I-95 express lanes. That's because it would decrease the revenue to the toll operator. And what's interesting is the contract itself specifically listed things that couldn't be addressed, and that's that second bullet there. So the state can't expand those without invoking a potential financial penalty. So I guess not surprisingly, when you talk to kind of local transportation planners in that area, they do feel kind of boxed in by this particular agreement. We have some information on the slide here, and we also have some appendix slide at the end that describe how congestion, it's going to be pretty persistent in that area, and it's a very challenging thing to try to address. And there's some information on some of VDOT's modeling in the appendix, which I won't go into. But VDOT did want us to make you aware that they and the CTB are looking into other options. There's been an effort underway that you can see on the slide, trying to look into things like operational improvements, multimodal projects that may help alleviate the problem, at least to some extent. Mr. Chairman, I covered a lot there. I will pause if there's any questions. Otherwise, I'll talk about P3 lessons learned.
Senator McPike, boy, I knew this was coming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your look. There are a number of different things that are highlighted here. I think you have some slides later on signage, and I'll wait for that. But certainly the Occoquan Bridge at 95, the 2001 VDOT 95 corridor study on its page 8 has a figure from North Carolina all the way up in terms of every interval and every section. I believe the Occoquan Bridge you listed and mentioned had an annual person's hours lost of 1.2 million hours of family time lost, commerce lost. The next closest one, I believe, on that chart was 175,000, and that's the Richmond area. So there's a huge multiplier factor of lost hours, and it's basically a couple mile stretch. I know in your slide, a couple slides ago, for the 12 billion per lane really is from like Thornburg to Springfield, but the actual section in the VDOT study is about a 5 mile section.
Yes.
That generates the 1.2 million hours lost, because you have a segment of Route 1 coming in, you've got a segment of 123 converging, all within a quarter mile. So you have major intersections converging. And is it right that any improvement to that 1.2 million of lost Virginian hours is prevented by the current, or would trigger a compensable event to Transurban?
The way it has been conveyed to me is that the contract is specific enough that the state would be, it would be incumbent on the vendor to bring the action, but it would be pretty likely that if there's any major improvements made there, the state would be liable for a potential event. And just to real briefly, we really tried to kind of quantify the monetary impact of that. Talked to a lot of people. No one really has it or guess, but everyone said it would be really big, whatever that means.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess it's more of a comment. The one thing that we know is really big is the 1.2 million hours of lost time. And so I'm not sure how we quantify that impact, but it is the worst spot in the entire East Coast by far. If you look at all the regional and national studies of transportation infrastructure, and it's something that we do have quantities on. And so unfortunately, this, Mr. Chairman, is something that continues to sort of go around in circles, tail wagging the dog, without any resolution or direction. If you look at the projected studies of actual resolution, yes, there's infrastructure that will help support, like the Long Bridge, but the long-lasting growth of projections still have failing infrastructure that needs to be addressed by Virginia. And it's got to start soon, or else we're going to continue to be decades behind. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Delegate Wilt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So back in the section there talking about the signage and so forth, I mean, is it accurate that the Federal Highway Administration oversees that? And
it's interesting. There's a really lengthy manual that gives different tiers of, let's say, guidance or suggestions. And there's some things that are kind of for an individual sign. This is the standard, and it should have this information on it. But there is some discretion in terms of what's allowable. And if you go back to the two examples that I showed, those are both acceptable under the manual. So it's interesting where at some point, states and maybe localities, if they want consistency or the same types of information, they kind of need to think ahead about that and require that if they're going to use the private sector to operate roads and do the signage.
Additional questions?
yes, Madam Chair.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Just big picture. I mean, we hear a lot about distracted driving and so forth. In the study, was that given consideration as far as, yes, there's just too many signs. There's too much information for drivers to try to, because you cited here, it's one thing, a stationary sign or a stationary message, but when they're moving, that concerns me.
It's something that comes up when you talk to people about it, and VDOT has an effort underway to try to look at this notion of, at a particular transition point when you're trying to drive and merge, how many signs can you actually look at, and then how much information can you absorb on those signs? So that's something they're taking a look at. But I think you're 100% correct that particularly if you're up there, there's a lot of traffic and there's a lot of signage. It's difficult to pick up the information you need to, whether you're distracted with other things or not, whether you have kids in the car or whatever. It's a challenge. There's no question about it.
Does that complete your question? Additional questions? Okay, you can go ahead.
So I'm going to go through the lessons learned real quickly here, and then I'll turn it over to Kate Hopkins to talk about 81. This is just background on how P3s work. These are just the types of risks that the state can transfer to the private sector when they enter into a P3. It can be pretty appealing if you do that. y'all know this, I'm sure, but Virginia actually is one of the most experienced states in the country at using P3s. They've been doing this for over 30 years, almost 30 years, I guess. There's 10 major P3s right now. Most of them are in Northern Virginia. P3s also are advantageous because they can bring large amounts of funding or capital that the state otherwise couldn't or doesn't want to bring to the table. But the rub, obviously, is that even though it's not on the state balance sheet, drivers repay the operator through tolls over a very long period of time. As I mentioned, Virginia probably has less to learn in other states because it's been doing this for a while. It's also been pointed out to us that there's limits to kind of applying lessons learned from prior P3s because these things can be kind of unique and you have to really think your way through each process. As some of our longer-serving members may recall, in terms of lessons learned, the statute has been revised over time to incorporate some lessons already learned, and I think this is particularly the case after the failed Route 60 project and the Elizabeth River Tunnels project. Now, the next lesson, it's pretty obvious here, but people don't like paying tolls. Economists say they're very efficient, and they are. This slide just shows there's a history, particularly out east, of kind of adding some funding to lessen the impact of those tolls. Another lesson is that as you enter into these P3s in a given region, particularly with different private entities, you do need to think ahead about transition points. I mentioned signage, but this is something that VDOT's aware of and they're trying to think through. But as you have roads managed by different vendors that come together, somebody has to be responsible for the exit ramps and the entrance ramps, and that's something VDOT's trying to figure out right now. This is that study that I mentioned to Delegate Wilt about the issue of signage. Last lesson learned here is there's something called an availability payment model, and that has some advantages that the next time the state does a P3, it may want to look into this. Under this model, the state can control the amount of tolls or subsidize the tolls, and they make set payments to the vendor. So it's something that when we talked to experts, they said the state should definitely think about the next time it does this. Florida and Pennsylvania are using this pretty widely. You do have to be attentive to the debt capacity issue if you do that. But we do think it's something that the state should think about the next time it does this. So, Mr. Chairman, if you're okay with it, I'm going to turn it over to Kate Hopkins to briefly summarize our work on the I-81 corridor.
Thank you. Were there any final questions for Mr. Brown? Okay. Welcome.
Thank you.
Please introduce yourself.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the Commission. I'm Kate Hopkins, and I'm an analyst at JLARC. I'm going to quickly walk through the final section of our presentation, which is focused on efforts to reduce congestion on I-81. So just to start with some background, this first slide shows a map of the I-81 corridor for your reference. The rolling terrain and high level of truck traffic along I-81 can cause significant congestion and delays on the interstate. That congestion can often be less predictable than the congestion on other Virginia interstates. VDOT is working on trying to improve congestion and safety along I-81 through the I-81 Corridor Improvement Program. This program uses dedicated funding for I-81 to make capital and operational improvements along the corridor. The map on slide 38 highlights where the major capital improvements are being made through the Corridor Improvement Program. They're generally located where the most significant congestion is. The figure on slide 39 shows the progress VDOT has been making since 2019 on the capital projects in the Corridor Improvement Program. You can see the initial focus of the program has been completing some of the relatively smaller improvement projects, such as curb improvements. Although VDOT has been making progress on I-81 improvements, the timeline and total costs of the Corridor Improvement Program have increased from what was initially expected. This is because of a few factors that are outlined on slide 40. One of the things we looked at in regards to I-81 was the sustainability of the funding for the corridor. In the short term, I-81 revenues are projected to slightly increase, but longer term, revenues will likely eventually decline as more people switch to electric and more fuel-efficient vehicles and use less gas and diesel. This transition will likely happen slowly, though. Although the current corridor improvement program is making a significant amount of improvements to I-81 over the course of the next decade, additional improvements have been identified as needed along the corridor. The next two slides provide two examples of these, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move quickly through them to slide 45. VDOT is planning to use all of the funding projected to be available for I-81 from now until the FY 35-36 timeframe to complete the current set of improvements. This means the corridor improvement program can't financially support any additional projects until then. In light of funding limitations, one idea that has come up is if a public-private partnership could be used to finance the improvements along I-81 and deliver them more quickly. VDOT explored this last year, but ultimately found the P3 approach infeasible for I-81. Finally, in terms of next steps for the corridor improvement program, factors like regional population growth will necessitate VDOT to reevaluate the corridor before moving out on the next suite of projects in the mid-2030s. The best time to restudy the corridor, though, still won't be for at least several more years. This last slide just walks through some of the reasoning for that. Mr. Chairman, that concludes our presentation. I know that was quick. We're happy to answer any additional questions.
Delegate Rasul.
I was actually pointing at Tony first.
Oh, well, Tony, would you like to go first? Your colleague is being very nice here.
Thank you, Delegate Rasul.
Okay.
I owe you lunch.
There you go.
Mr. Chairman,
Just get on 81 and you'll meet in the middle there.
There you go.
So your comment about the study and VDOT finding that P3 was not practical, can you tell us why?
Sure. So Delegate Will, VDOT, the consultants that VDOT worked with to take a look at the P3 approach on I-81 considered a managed lane on I-81, considered widening the corridor via managed lane, which is like the express lanes up in Northern Virginia. And essentially, there's not enough recurring congestion on I-81 for there to be enough demand for a managed lane. And so the concessionaire wouldn't be able to recoup their investment just from the toll revenue itself, and the state would need to subsidize the project pretty heavily. And so for that reason, as well as some legal challenges and political challenges associated with tolling, they came back and determined it wasn't feasible.
Delegate Rasul.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question around the 41 capital improvements that were lower priority in 2018.
Mm-hmm.
Has VDOT or any of the stakeholders, separate from the new issues that have come up now, said that those are of higher priority?
Delegate Rasul, so they haven't come up as being higher priority than what's currently in the plan and currently either under construction or will be under construction through now until the mid-2030s. A few of those projects are some of the projects that were kind of re-highlighted as still needing to be improved. And so there's an example on slide 43 near Lexington. That was something that was initially a project identified in 2018, was deprioritized because of funding limitations, but still continues to seem to be needed.
Final question, Mr. Chair.
Delegate Rasul.
My predecessor, who just left us recently, one of his achievements was to bring the train back to Roanoke. And we've just now, I think, doubled that as we're moving forward. I think the question is do we see any blip on the radar? Has that come up in any of the conversations that any additional train capacity could help to alleviate at all what's happening on 81?
Delegate Rasul, that wasn't something that specifically came up, but as part of the corridor improvements, there are multimodal improvements, such as passenger rail that you're referring to, as well as additional public transit options, the Virginia Breeze bus service. So I know that is something that's underway, but it wasn't something that was really highlighted as could make a meaningful difference as much as these highway improvements.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I may have missed this, but have they studied truck lanes or just requiring on the current facility to limit the trucks to 2 lanes of the through? I guess there's only 2 lanes in a lot of places. One direction, 4 lanes.
Mr. Chairman, do you mean enforcement of?
No, yeah, enforcement, but
Okay.
yeah, say trucks have to travel in the right lane.
Yes, there's requirements in the code. I believe when it's 2 lanes on ID1, they need to travel on the right lane. When it's 3 lanes, they need to travel on the 2 rightmost lanes.
Okay, and that's enforced,
It is enforced. We did hear comments that it would be helpful for there to be more enforcement of that.
okay. Yeah, Senator Pike.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Page 51 shows a sort of example of something that's fairly frustrating. So the sign in the example does not really exist today. What's posted is sort of multiple dynamic times flashing across screens as someone's traveling 45 miles an hour. Unfortunately, what intuitively happens a lot of times is you'll see a price of a toll on the express lanes as higher than normal. And so for a stretch of road that could be $8, $12, $15, but jump up to 20. Intuitively, someone might think, wow, the main lines must be really bad. Let me jump on the express lanes to avoid that really bad traffic. Unfortunately, the express lanes could be jammed up with an accident. So there's counterintuitive messaging that happens that is confusing to drivers that sort of reverses their behavior, believe it or not. So congestion tolling doesn't mean stay away sometimes. It might mean, wow, they think the main lines are really bad. So I've got to pay this to get to work and save myself an hour to go 20 miles. And the miles and costs we're talking about are typically 15 to 20 miles that can run you $50 on a daily basis one way, depending on what's going on. And so the consistency of signage and the actual information when people are driving is really important VDOT get right. Not only that, but I think what was also mentioned earlier was the contract consistency across providers is also sort of all over the place. And I think the axles is one example. I know Mr. Chairman had a constituent that got charged $30,000 for his landscaping business because he had axles simply towing mowers, whereas axles is really a proxy for weight and damage to road. Well, that lawn landscaping company wasn't damaging a road because of the multiple axle issue. So he got charged like he was an 18-wheeler. Fortunately, that was settled. But the contract provisions, as I understand it, allow each provider to determine how to functionally resolve those issues and or build those issues depending on which road. And these companies travel all those roads in a single day. And so a driver having an employee try to interpret what's it going to cost my business depending on whether I make a left turn, right turn, or go straight is practically what's happening to folks. And hopefully VDOT can really focusing in on standardizing the contract provisions to make sure they're applied fairly and equitably across all the road system. And I'm hoping they'll do some work on this. And I appreciate the staff's diligence in looking at this. We just need to make sure that as we apply things, there's fairness and equity involved in how the contracts are administered. You know, it's one green sign to one road to the next. They think it's all one system, and it's really not, because it's all generated by contract provisions. And Mr. Chairman, you know, it's my hope as we deal with I-81, in other areas, we've got to focus on the Occoquan Bridge. I mean, it is a significant daily impact of millions of hours lost. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I went across it this morning, and there was a huge accident in the express lanes about 7:45 this morning in northern Prince William County. But there was several car pileup. Everybody in the express lanes that were paying probably $20 was at a complete halt. Of course, the free lanes were also jammed, so everything was a mess going north. And I was just wondering, is there any way to compensate these people? And first of all, are we telling them not to get in there? Because you drive 10 miles or maybe 6 or 7 miles south, people are still getting in the express lanes, and they don't know that they're going to be stopped in 2 miles, complete stop.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know that we're not telling them to enter into the express lanes. I think to Senator McPike's point, a sign like this could potentially be helpful with that.
And how about,
Mr.
is there
Chair.
any chance for a refund? And
Mr. Chairman, that is not something I'm familiar with, but we can follow up if that'd be helpful.
Senator Deeds.
You need to write them a strong letter and get the refund policy set up. I would suggest the signage on 51, and the discussion from you, Mr. Chair, and from Senator Pike is exactly why the triple P won't work on 81. I remember a time close to 20 years ago when William Wampler represented that far southwest part of Virginia in the state Senate, and we passed legislation to prevent tolls from ever having played a role in 81, and that was because of the use of that highway as a commuter road for people, particularly in southwest Virginia. But the truck lanes in Montgomery County, the truck lanes in Rockbridge County seem to work pretty well, and people do a good job of I think there's a slide on page 43 that shows proposed truck lanes on 81. I think that's a great idea. I think, and the trucks do a pretty good job of staying when the lanes are supposed to.
Okay. Any other comments here? Okay, thank you very much. Oh, no. Okay, is this the custom? No, we got one more whole subject to go through. Oh, I thought, Justin, you wanted to come back up again.
Good morning,
okay.
Mr. Oh.
Yes.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm Kimberly Sarte. I'm an associate director with JLARC, and we will try to move through this as quickly as possible. Just quickly, the Appropriation Act does give JLARC responsibility to evaluate the state's economic development incentives on an ongoing basis. And so the report that we will be presenting today on the state's custom incentive grants is part of that ongoing effort. And it's actually part of a series of reports we've released on this topic. To conduct our reviews, we do partner with consultants with expertise in economic impact analysis and modeling. So I'd also like to acknowledge Terry Repham from UVA's Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service, who's one of our consultants. So now I'd like to introduce Ellen Miller, who will be presenting our findings on the state's custom incentive grants.
Thank you, Kimberly. Mr. Chairman, almost afternoon. Again, my name is Ellen Miller, and I'll be presenting our findings of the evaluation of Virginia's custom performance grants, and I'll try to get through this fairly quickly, so I'll skip through the first couple of slides and start here. So our report covers 17 custom performance grants that were awarded between fiscal year 6 and fiscal year 23 to companies that are listed here on this slide. Some of you are on the MEI Commission that approves or endorses, I would rather, custom projects. And I will say that the Micron grant that's listed here is the 2018 grant that Micron was awarded and is presently being terminated, and there is a new grant being considered. So just to make sure you are aware of which grant we're looking at. So slide 5 lists our key findings, and I'll start with the fact that Virginia's use of custom performance grants has increased in recent years. In more recent time period, it's represented 68% of the total amount of grant awards, of all grant awards. Custom grants are generally well designed, but some projects meet only a subset of characteristics of high impact projects. However, custom grants had a higher ability to sway location and expansion decisions, and they also met their job creation goals at higher rates than other grant programs. Most custom grants also generate moderate or high economic benefits. So I'll start with some background on custom grants. This slide shows the process for how a custom proposal is developed. And the main thing that I want to point out here is that, when VEDP is looking at a project, it may find that a project is outside of the scope of existing programs, and a custom proposal is needed. And when that occurs, they'll share the proposal with the company, and if the company accepts the proposal, then it takes the proposal to the MEI Commission for its endorsement, which is needed because the program does not have any statutory or budgetary authorization. And then ultimately it has to be approved by the full General Assembly and the governor. So slide 8 just briefly points out that custom grants are typically much larger than most other economic development incentive grants. And you can see that the median award, the jobs that are created, and the capital investment that the companies are expected to make are much, much larger. So on slide 9, you'll see that altogether the 17 custom awards totaled nearly $1.2 billion between fiscal year 6 and fiscal year 23. And I'll note that 2/3 of that amount is actually just for one project, which is the Amazon headquarters project. This slide just reiterates the point that custom grants represent a large portion of the grant awards that are awarded. And Mr. Chairman, I'll pause here if there are any questions before I get into effectiveness.
I don't see anybody who wants to ask one, so thank you.
Okay, thank you. So our first finding is that Virginia's custom grants are generally well designed, but some projects only meet a subset of characteristics of high impact projects. So we say they're well designed because they have to meet minimum job creation, average wage, and capital investment thresholds. They also are subject to VEDP's due diligence and return on investment analysis. Most grants are paid in installments after performance milestones or targets are met. And those that aren't, like Micron, for example, that one was paid up front, but there were recapture provisions if performance targets were not met. And finally, the majority of custom grants target high impact and competitive projects and often help fund things like workforce training or infrastructure improvement. This slide points out the projects that met either all or nearly all of the high impact characteristics. And the next slide shows the remaining projects, and you'll see that all but one of the projects met at least two. And another thing I'll point out about this slide is that for the most part, all the projects met tradable industry and high employment multiplier industry. The two characteristics that projects met less consistently were paying above the average local wage and being in a strong industry cluster. So my next section covers our findings about how much custom grants influence business decisions. So we found that custom grants had a higher ability to sway location or expansion decisions than other grant programs. 4 grants in particular had a much higher ability to sway business decisions than the typical custom grant project, or the typical grant project. And we also found through surveying grant recipients, and we surveyed custom grant as well as recipients of other projects or other programs, what we found is that the recipients reported the custom grants had a higher rate of influence than other grant programs. We also found that custom grants are more frequently offered to projects that are considering other states compared with other grants, and that more custom grant recipients would have proceeded at an out-of-state location without the custom grant compared to other programs. My next section will cover performance related to job creation goals. And you see here on slide 21 that collectively custom grants met or exceeded their goals since 2016. And this slide just shows goal achievement on a per project basis. And you'll see that about half of the custom projects either met their performance goals or are on track to meet their performance goals. And those are the ones that are still in progress. Half, you may wonder, is that good or not? But when you compare that to the goal achievement of other programs, you actually see that custom grants achieve their job creation goals at higher rates. So I'll pause there before going to economic benefits if there are any questions.
I don't see any hands up. Thank you.
Okay. So when you look at all custom grants together, what we found is that they have high economic benefits and high return in revenue. And some of you are new members. And so if you have a question about how we came up with this rating system for rating the various projects, I'd be glad to answer it, or I will also point you to Appendix C in our report. It provides a pretty brief description about how we do that.
Did VEDP agree with your assessment on what are the best projects that they've done?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, can you repeat
Do you
that?
agree with your ranking system about which were the most productive custom grants?
I would say they didn't disagree with it.
Okay. Oh, you could run for
We didn't
election,
ask that specific question, but they didn't raise any major concerns about that. The main point that I'll say here is that, again, collectively, we rated the custom grants as having a high economic benefit, and that's because most of the custom grants either had high economic benefits and return in revenue when we looked at them individually, or they had moderate. And I'll focus on this next slide, which shows the ones that had high returns. You may be surprised that Micron and Volvo are on this list because I have listed them as being terminated or in the process of terminating. And basically that's because of the performance-based system for paying out the grants. Payments aren't made until performance actually occurs. And so these two projects were only paid for what they actually did. And so I just wanted to point out here that it appears based on these two projects that the performance-based nature of the payments is working as intended. The other grants that are on this slide, I'll note that they overperformed. If you go back to the slide where I showed the job creation or the achievement rankings, you'll see that those are projects that overperformed there. And they also had higher employment multipliers than some of the other projects. And I'll just briefly go through these, just flip through these in the interest of time. And then I'll pause here again, Mr. Chairman, to see if there are any questions before I move on to the last section.
The questions, Delegate Wilt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Briefly, what all did you use to measure the economic benefits? I mean, how broad did you go?
We've used the same process that we have for all of the other projects. And basically what we do is we look at the job creation, the capital investment of each project, and based on what was stated in the MOU and what they have actually done based on performance reports. We look at how much the grant likely influenced the project. And so each project is scaled. So say a company is expected to create 100 jobs to get this grant. We scale that amount back. So say the typical project is expected to create about 10% of that, influence 10% of that activity. The rest of the activity would occur anyway. So we'll scale those jobs and the capital investment back. And then that's where, this is really the area that Terry works on, and he inputs that information into the REMI, which is a statistical economic modeling software. It's very similar to M-Plan. You might also be familiar with that package. And basically that's where we get our economic impact results from that.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Just a quick thought.
Sure.
And I really appreciate that. It's vitally important. But let's not forget also I call the ancillary benefits. I mean, so you got a big company comes in, they get established, they're paying, they hire their people, they're paying good wages. But let's also remember the other businesses around that either get created or they expand or they benefit from this initial investment. So that likely increases the pool. You can't calculate everything, but
actually that is built into the model. The effects, the ripple effects in the economy are in the model as well.
Okay. I wanted to ask about the AWS.
Sure.
We still have a program to bring data centers. We've got $75 billion worth of availability to build new data centers in Virginia, I believe. So when you say the program is terminated, what AWS still is actively pursuing investment in Virginia?
Right, that particular program is
Okay,
terminated. I might have misspoke, I'm
So it's a
sorry.
particular program that they had specifically that's used up all the incentive grant money?
So the AWS custom grant that we looked at was actually to locate their headquarters in Virginia, and that was approved in like 2018, 19, that time frame. That project has completed, but you're right, Mr. Chairman, there is another custom grant, the cloud computing grant that was recently awarded that is still, we didn't evaluate that particular project, but that has not been terminated, no.
Okay. And also, there's a big asterisk on the Micron project, but we won't go into that.
Right. So based on our findings, we don't believe that major changes to the state's use of custom grants appear needed. However, because formal guidelines for awarding custom grants do not exist, we think that formal guidelines should be adopted for VEDP to use in developing custom grant proposals, and also for the MEI Commission to use to help them to identify good projects to endorse. These guidelines can be modeled after VEDP guidelines for its existing discretionary grants like COF, but tailored to custom grants. I will highlight a few suggestions that are in our report for what the guidelines should include based on our evaluation. However, I will say that many of you are MEI members, and the development and approval process for the guidelines gives you an opportunity to provide input into what the guidelines say. So first, the guidelines should recommend custom award amounts be more closely correlated with the project's ROI. Per-job awards for other VEDP grants are higher for projects that pay higher average wages and have higher employment multipliers, but this is not the case for the custom grants. We couldn't find any pattern between factors that should influence ROI and custom award amounts. In fact, there's a wide variation in the award per job for custom grants and in the ROI across projects. And the project with the lowest ROI has one of the highest per job awards. Guidelines should also recommend that custom projects include a wage escalation factor so that wages don't decrease over time, which could certainly happen because of the performance period for the custom grants is pretty long. It's much longer than the typical grant program like COF, which is 3 to 5 years. The custom grant, the average is about 11 years, and some extend to 20 years. Instead of a static escalation factor like the one that has been used for 7 custom grants, we suggest just basing it on changes to CPI or something like the Employment Cost Index to better reflect the inflationary environment. And then we also recommend that projects align with state or regional economic development strategies, such as VEDP's core sector strategy. Our analysis found that 8 custom projects were not in strong industry sectors. The report also lists a few other guidelines that we think should be considered, like a minimum wage threshold and local match guidelines. And last, I'll mention that the guidelines should be viewed as guidelines and not necessarily binding, so that VEDP and MEI still has some discretion, particularly if a project that appears to be high impact comes up, but it doesn't meet some of the guidelines. And Mr. Chairman, this is the recommendation to develop and adopt guidelines.
Okay.
And with that, that concludes my prepared remarks, but I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Any questions? Well, thank you. This is a very, very high on people's list of looking at state government and how we do things, and so it probably would be good to have some guidelines. Part of what's going on now, you have to say, is that we're trying as a country to try to reshore a lot of industries that are overseas. And we have the CHIPS Act that passed. There's a lot of money sitting on the table and the federal government has. And so they may not fit all your ROI models, but, we're bringing a brand new semiconductor technology into the state now with use of these grants. And it's a national security issue as well as a trade. It's bigger than Virginia. And so I'm hoping that I see someone from VEDP here, and I'm hoping that they're aggressively pursuing the money that is available from our federal government now to help reshore critical industries. That's just commentary.
Mr. Chairman, you'll be relieved to know that concludes our agenda for today. Our next meeting will be Monday, July 1st, again at 10 a.m. The primary topics will be the Virginia Retirement System and Virginia 529. We'll have the leadership from both here with us. And Stacy will be back to discuss results from some of the APA's work. Thank you very much for your attention today.
Well, thank you. We're only 17 minutes over. We caught up some.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Greer before we go? Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Appreciate all the help and all the hard work.
Thank you.
Yep.